Chapter 7, Deviance, Crime, and Social Control. In this chapter, we will cover these three modules. Module 23, Social Control, Module 24, What is Deviance, and Module 25, Crime. The questions we will ask ourselves are, what are the relationships among deviance and conformity, crime, and social control? So how are these concepts related? What is deviance and what are its consequences? Then we're going to talk about what causes crime. What are the various types of crime in the United States? And lastly, how does society control people's behavior, convincing us to conform to both the unwritten rules and the formal laws? First, we'll define social control. And social control refers to the ways in which deviant human behavior is prevented. Deviant behavior is behavior that violates our social norms, something we talked about in our earlier chapter. Social control occurs within our families, among our peers, in bureaucratic organizations, and by the government. Members of society are expected to act properly. For the most part, we are socialized to abide by the dominant standards of our culture. We learn to accept the social norms that in turn influence our behavior. If or when we deviate from these accepted norms, we face sanctions. And sanctions could be either penalties or rewards for conduct concerning a social norm. So as you see on this slide, social control occurs on all levels of society. We see within our families, we are socialized to obey our parents. Among our peer groups, we start to be introduced to informal norms. We want to be accepted by our peers, and so we may conform. And so that is a form of social control among our peers. At colleges, we have standards for students that students must obey and follow. In bureaucratic organizations where we tend to work, there's going to be a formal system of rules and regulations that we need to agree to. And of course, at the government level, where they legislate and enforce social norms, and those become, what are written into law. So most people do respect and accept the basic social norms of our society, but the sanctions will apply when there are we either comply to the norm or don't go along with the norm. So there'll be penalties or rewards for our conduct concerning the social norm. People often, receive competing messages about how people should behave. If we fail to live up to the norm, we may face informal sanctions, fear or ridicule, or formal sanctions like a jail sentence or a fine. So informal sanctions occur when fear or ridicule is inflicted on someone for deviating from the norm. Formal sanctions are things like fines or jail sentences. Those are the norms that are written into law. Now, the death penalty is the ultimate formal sanction that is often the subject of much debate. Controversy is centered on how effective the death penalty is as a form of social control. So there is controversy around the actual effect, and many protests because with the new technology that exists in society today, many people who are on death row have been exonerated, have been shown to not have committed the crimes that they've been accused of and are sitting in jail for waiting to be executed. The DNA tests and things like that, or has further proven that the person committed the particular act. So again, a lot of controversy around this subject. Now, if we think about theory, here we are, we're going to just concentrate here on functionalist theory and conflict theory. Theory and social control. Now, how it applies to social control. Functionalists would say that in order for any group or society to survive, people must respect social norms and abide by standards of appropriate conduct. So following these norms maintains the social stability, and it keeps society functioning. Anytime there's a disruption in that deviance, you'll see dysfunction in society. Conflict theorists, though, argue that the functioning of society benefits the most powerful, and that social norms reflect the interests of the dominant class. The resistance to social norm, though, results in social change, in the social structure. If you think back to the times of the civil rights movement, so civil disobedience, that, where there has been injustice, disobeying those norms that many people have felt were unjust, created social change. Same thing with the women's rights movement in the fight for the women's right to vote. Many women felt it was unfair that women couldn't vote. And so, fighting against that norm and protesting against that norm resulted in change. And even the Occupy movement right now, today, we see the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that. That would be, people really banding together and organizing against an unjust part of society. And thus, conflict theorists would argue that it benefits those who are less powerful, and then they can result in social change in our social structure. Okay, so social control takes place at the group level, but it also takes place at the societal level. And our actions and behaviors are influenced by both our peers as well as persons of authority. Now, social psychologist Stanley Milgram defined conformity as going along with peers, even though they have no special right to direct our behavior. If we think about our peer groups, we conform to language, we adopt similar, expressions of language, dress, to go along with the group, activities, things like that. And obedience refers to complying with higher authorities in a hierarchy or a hierarchical structure. So a military recruit follows the superior's orders. An example is that. And hopefully, if you've watched that brief clip on that I posted on the Stanford prison experiment, there is a brief portion and segment in the that video that actually shows you and illustrates Milgram's experiment. Milgram conducted this experiment of obedience in the early about 1962, 1963. And he recruited subjects in Connecticut to be conducted at Yale University. So around time, people were trying to understand, do people really obey authority? How could people in an atrocity like the Holocaust, when good people would follow along with somebody like a charismatic leader such as Hitler and just not, say, no, this is wrong. And so this experiment was a way to try to understand that. So the experimenter what the experimenter was instructed to do, he actually, it was men at the time, instructed the test subjects to administer electric shocks to the individual, answering questions on a memory test. So each time a question was answered wrong, they increased the intensity of the electrical shock. Now, the person who was administering the shock was the person under the experiment. The person on the other side of the screen, although it seemed that they were randomly placed there, that person was actually an actor. They were there to act out on the other side, but the test subject didn't know that. 2/3 of participants fell into a category that Milgram described as obedient subjects. So although 40% of the participants stopped, nearly 2/3 continued to listen to what they were told and were classified as these obedient subjects. According to Milgram, what he described is that behavior that is unthinkable in an individual acting on his own may be executed without hesitation when carried out under orders. So obeying this authority figure, this person in this white, lab coat with a clipboard, telling this person that, you need to continue doing this, even though the person on the other side of the screen is crying out in pain and asking them to stop. People in modern industrial worlds accustomed to submitting to impersonal authority figures. We do this all the time. We, when we're not sure about something, we call a doctor, we ask a teacher, we ask our coaches, we ask our parents. I remember when I was a new mom and, my son was crying and I did everything I thought. I fed him, I changed him, I thought everything, and he was still crying, and I'd call my mom, the expert in my family on mothering. We do these sorts of things because, someone may have more experience than us, or they may know something we are not catching on to. So we tend to do this. Now, studies have shown that people are more willing to obey if they believe the victim deserves some sort of punishment. So if the person on the other side of the screen is doing something wrong, then they might think, well, then they may, do this. So that's where it relates back to the Holocaust. The propaganda that was being put out by the Nazi Party is that anyone who was Jewish or who were of a different, stereotype that was categorized by the Nazis, as inferior or bad. They classified them as being bad, and so that they deserve this punishment. So that sort of internalizes into these good people that think, well, they're bad. They must be doing something wrong, and they must deserve this sort of punishment. That's sort of the logic behind it, although it comes from a bad source. Now, this study, which was done, quite a long time ago, has been replicated a number of times, and there's been some interesting results when the experiment was replicated. And the race of the subject was considered. So very interestingly, while more likely, whites were more likely to shock black learners by 70% than they were to shock white learners, 48%. So, and this was psychologist Jerry Berger. So if you wanted to take a look at that, 2009, who repeated the study and reached similar findings to the original Milgram experiment. But very interesting when race is then introduced. And so, again, having this false stereotypical ideal that one race may be inferior to another, and then therefore more likely to send those shocks. So again, you could see some evidence to that here in this experiment. Now, we submit to impersonal authority figures because of the value that we place on who they are. So as I mentioned, teachers, doctors, even police officers, anyone who has a higher ranking, high-ranking officials in, the justice system, we will submit to their authority based on the value we place on them in those particular positions. Now, if we think about this in terms of informal and formal social control, informal social control is where people casually enforce our social norms, and this is on our everyday sort of interactions. This informal and formal social control is used to encourage this conformity and obedience while discouraging a violation of social norms or what we call deviant behavior. The informal social control is carried out casually by ordinary people through such means as, laughter. If somebody tells a joke, somebody will laugh at it and encourages them, maybe to tell another joke. Or if someone does something, shocking, so you raise an eyebrow or ridicule them, so forth. So we do this a lot with children too, to either encourage good, positive behavior, discourage naughty behavior. Corporal punishment is an ineffective but supported type of informal social control. Corporal punishment being spanking and things like that. The Academy of Pediatrics has come out with numerous studies that say how ineffective that is. It could be, it can end a behavior in the short term, but in the long term, it doesn't necessarily, is not as effective. Formal social control is carried out by authorized agents such as police officers, judges, school administrators, employers. And some examples are, sending someone to prison, imprisonment, speeding tickets, the death penalty. So these can serve as a last resort when socialization and informal social controls do not work. We mentioned earlier, about prison and the death penalty. Approximately 1 out of 30 adult Americans are sent to prison every year. Sometimes informal social control can encourage people to violate social norms. And so what I mean by this is that in the case of binge drinking, for example, on college campuses, it may be socially acceptable to conform to drinking behaviors among peers in, say, a fraternity house or sorority house where, parties are going on. And you've got, students of different ages, students who are of legal age to drink, but then, a lot of times they invite the younger student body into their parties, and but there have been some negative consequences. Binge drinking and serious deaths that have occurred, but because of the increase in that, formal sanctions are being enforced on campus. Banning these parties, expelling students, enforcing liquor stores who sell to students in high volumes. So here students are following the norm of the peer group, but then disobeying the formal norm, which is underage drinking. So that would be an example of that. As we mentioned, the death penalty has historically served as a significant form of social control. And also, in addition, we've seen new measures of social control that were established after September 11th. Increased security and surveillance at the airports. Governments encouraging citizens to watch out for and report suspicious behavior in the subways or on the buses. And, if you see it, report it. If you see a strange-looking bag, after the Boston Marathon where backpacks were left with explosives inside and caused, great tragedy there. So new measures become evident after some things happen, and so to try to again protect, the society and population. Solitary confinement is also considered a very harsh form of social control within prisons, and we saw that as evidenced even in the example in the Stanford prison experiment. We do lock someone away. How effective is that as a means to control someone? Does it really deter the behavior from occurring again? So you need to think about, the effectiveness of things like the death penalty and solitary confinement. And Americans become more accepting of things like the security and surveillance on them after an incident like September 11th. So you need to think about those things as well, and whether these things are, how effective they are. Now, some norms are so important that laws are written about them. And so the next thing we're going to talk about are law and society. And law is defined as governmental social control. Now, some laws are directed at all members of society, like the one that says it's not okay to murder someone, or it's not okay to abuse children, it's not okay to steal. But some laws are affecting only a particular category of people. So if you hunt or you fish, there are laws specific to you. So hunting and fishing regulations. I don't hunt and I don't fish, so they don't really apply to me. But I know there are laws that are in effect that those people who do know, they know the time of year it's okay to hunt, and what particular, is it turkey season, is it deer season, at what time does that season start, how many, and what size of, who you're hunting. So without getting into any gruesome detail, that would be along the lines of that. And some laws govern social institutions. So there are creation of laws, it's a social process. But some of these laws that govern a particular institution, like corporate laws that pertain only to, corporations, divorce laws, laws for somebody who's getting divorced. So if somebody who's happily married and is that law won't apply to them unless, of course, they're going to go through the divorce process. So sociologists view this, these creation of these laws as that social process, and that usually reflects the values of those in a position of authority. So, for example, think about during the time of alcohol prohibition. At the time, women were complaining that their husbands were coming home, completely intoxicated, and so there became a time where they were going to try to, okay, let's prohibit the use of alcohol. Now they found a way around it by creating speakeasies. So again, some things that just cannot get away from people. If there is a there's a will, there's a way, kind of expression. But it depends on what is valued at the time. At the time, women were very, very distressed. But we see more currently different laws regarding, say, marijuana use, and how the legal order reflects the values of those in power. Many feel that marijuana laws, marijuana should be legalized. So there's been changes over time in the medical use of marijuana and how effective it could be for many people going through cancer treatments. I know some families in the autism and community that their children who have suffered seizures, who are really severely autistic, that marijuana has benefited their children even. So, the evidence has shown that as people's values change over things like that, we'll start to see the laws change. Another example is same-sex marriage. For so long, there has been debate over that. Many religious still may not completely agree with same-sex marriage. However, constitutionally, and the rights to everyone to be able to love who they want to love, and we've seen changes in the laws that are now gay marriage laws have been changed over time. So we see that these laws will definitely change as people's values and understanding and knowledge start to change. Now, there's a sociologist by the name of Travis Hershey, who suggests that our connections to our family members, our friends, our peers, leads us to systematically conform to society's norms. And this is known as control theory. Socialization is the main source of our obedience to many laws and to the control. So those agents of socialization, we conform and obey to those agents of socialization. Our bonds to others make us more willing to want to follow the mores and folkways. So it develops, our socialization develops our self-control. So it starts and grows over our lifetime, over the life course. So this slide here represents the status of state legalization of marijuana, and the green states are the states that allow personal possession and consumption by adults. The yellow states, there are 37 of them, authorize the use for a wide range of medical purposes, subject to federal cooperation. And then there are 5 states that have no provision for legalization or medical use. So the green states is where marijuana is legalized for recreational use as well as medical use. So as you see, the more states start to get on board, I think initially it was only 1 state and 1 or 2 It was California, it was out west. So, we're seeing more and more as people change their opinions and knowledge and look at studies about it. We'll see that continue to change. Okay, so what happens when we deviate from society's norms? So in this module, we're going to talk about what is deviance. Sociologists define deviance as behavior that violates the standards of conduct or expectations of a group or society. So for example, criminals, alcoholics, compulsive gamblers, the mentally ill are all considered to be deviants. However, being late, wearing jeans to a formal occasion are also considered to be deviant acts. Deviance involves the violation of group norms. It's not always negative, like in the case of a police officer blowing the whistle on corruption, or like someone who stands up to or deviates from the traditional discriminatory norms in society. So, when these things occur, we're seeing somebody who's really standing up against something that they think to be unjust. Now, deviance is subject to social definition within a particular society and at a particular time. In other words, what is considered deviant at one point in time may become more acceptable socially at another point, and vice versa. So one example of this, I usually help to describe this situation, is smoking. I remember a time when my father at one point was a very heavy smoker. We'd walk into a restaurant and we asked to be seated in the smoking section. Well, as the public health officials have really come down on the fact that how bad smoking is for your health, and so you've got the tobacco industry and you've got the healthcare industry really fighting on how smoking is bad for your health. And so now we've started to see these laws change. So what was considered a norm, people lighting up everywhere, now we've limited where people can smoke. We haven't taken a right away from anybody, but smoking that once was popular, even with the medical warnings, we have more limitations on where you can't smoke in a restaurant. Then you used to be confined to a smoking section, or you were confined to the bar area. Now you can't. Now you have to. You can't smoke at all inside a restaurant. You have to go outside. And for many companies, it's the same thing. So deviance from norms it's not always negative. Again, it can create some positive changes in society, and it's very subjective based on the societal standards of the time. Symbolic interactionist Irving Goffman, as we talk about deviance and social stigma, he coined this term, stigma, and which are labels that society uses to devalue members of certain groups. It's usually based on physical behavior or characteristics. For example, all redheads and blondes, wearing tattered clothing, and that stigma is associated with being homeless. Or it can be related to a person's past behavior, being a recovering alcoholic, being an ex-convict, and somebody who's been in prison is no longer in prison. So sort of the stigma is attached. Goffman distinguishes between two things. He distinguishes between a stigma symbol, which is something that discredits or debases one's identity, like having a criminal conviction on your record. Sex offenders in particular is a good example where, once they've been accused or convicted of a sex crime, those persons then have that label and are known in the community, in the neighborhoods. There's a list of where they're living, so the community is then aware. But a prestige symbol, on the other hand, in comparison or contrast to that, is something that draws attention to a positive aspect of one's identity. So, for example, police officers' uniform and badge, or a judge's gowns, that sort of thing, brings prestige to that particular. A doctor's lab coat and stethoscope, that sort of thing. Homelessness also has a stigmatizing effect. It makes it very difficult for a person to find employment when they're homeless. Employers may be a little leery to hire them because of, their lack of having roots and established, roots in a home. They may not be able to have an address to send them things, to, permanent address to have a phone to even be contacted through. So many people have to overcome those big challenges, but they can overcome them. And many examples of people, two huge examples that I'm aware of is Tyler Perry. Many of you may know him. He's become very, very successful in terms of his movies and his career, but he was homeless, and he speaks of that. And then there's another example. Jewel is a singer. I don't know if anybody's familiar with her. She often spoke about how she would write many of her songs living out of her car, and so overcoming homelessness and overcoming that stigma is possible. Some types of deviance will stigmatize a person while others do not. We have there's examples of, again, depending on social class even. Martha Stewart, for example, she's an ex-convict. She's served time. She was in prison for stock market fraud, and has come out of prison, served her time, paid her dues, but has become still successful in her TV shows and her products and things like that. So again, it may or may not ultimately continue to affect others. Let's talk about a little bit about deviance in technology. Technological innovations can redefine our social interactions and our standards of behavior. And this is often where we find socially tolerated forms of deviance. The anonymity, being anonymous, often allows for deviant behaviors, such as things like hate speech, even pornography, bullying, cyberbullying. Seen it happen firsthand. Someone just recently, my son, innocently enough, is searches YouTube for Elmo videos. It's something he's into, but somebody went online and cyberbullied him and said, something very, cruel about, him being needing to be a punching bag. It was just that I actually had to intervene because he was so upset. He was in tears over it. But this kind of behavior, because you're behind a computer screen, and so many people feel they have cyber muscles, and they feel that it's okay to, they don't know the other person and how hurtful their words can be, although they probably should. So some deviance, this uncivil behavior takes place. It can get really bad in terms of hate speech and using that technology to really be hurtful and stand on a platform that is hurtful to other people, depending on their gender, their race, their ethnicity, even their age. Young people versus old people. And so, posting pictures of people can be very hurtful. There's been an excessive use of online advertisements through technology. We can also see calls to, there have been calls to establish, there's been a culture lag in this sort of technology. It's out there, and it's taking society a while to catch up. So maybe establishing rules, netiquette, I think they call it, having proper etiquette on the net, especially in these social forums, there also been some deviant use of technology, and some people weren't even aware of it. So some deviant uses of technology, like software pirating and downloading music from the internet, is criminal. You're taking software that's licensed for a particular computer system. And I remember this happening quite a bit when people were just starting to try to work from home. It was just at the beginning stages, and employers were giving their employees disks. Much of the software that you couldn't just download it back then. You had a floppy disk or a set of floppy disks, and they would send employees home, loading it on their computers at home, and so that they could actually take their work home with them. But that was against the law because you were only licensed to, you had to purchase a license to be able to do that on more than one computer. And so that was, that's basically stealing. Same thing with music. You can't just, download tons and tons of music without paying for it because, someone along the line owns the rights to those things, and movies and music. And that's why a lot of the movies we see sometimes on YouTube that I can download for students, some of it has commercials in it, and that's how the advertising is able to pay to, for the use of viewing those different things. So some people are being deviant and they don't even realize it. Okay, so next we're going to talk about some of our theories and how they relate to explanations on some of this deviance. So we're going to try to get to an understanding using our sociological perspectives on deviance. Why do people violate social norms? Or why do, on the other flip side of that, why do people obey social norms? So in trying to explain why deviance occurs, early explanations really focused on the supernatural causes, or they focused on genetic factors, biology, that somebody might have had bad blood and that's why they were deviant, something inborn. The research, much of this research examined biological factors in order to explain criminal acts and deviance. What is it about someone's genetics that would predispose a person to criminal acts? Sort of something having a characteristic like, someone's aggressive. Well, aggression, you could turn it and use it into a very criminal behavior, criminal act. But sometimes aggression can be very useful, and somebody who's trying to climb the corporate ladder, and that's aggression or aggressiveness to do that, to achieve success in business and sports and things like that, can really drive someone to work really hard. So, we see a lot of the research. In fact, a professor I had at Temple, Dr. Savitz, he used to, I took a couple of his classes, crime and film and criminology and sociology, and he talked of how, prisoners, criminals who were in prison life sentences, or prisoners who ultimately died in prison. They did autopsies on them, and what they would do is they would measure the brain size of a criminal, often to see, what was it about their brain that, would subject them to this type of criminal behavior. So a lot of this early research, became discredited. Contemporary research has really looked at other factors, even personality traits, what personality traits. But we as sociologists are very critical of a lot of this, and the emphasis on genetic roots of crime. We think somebody's born to be a criminal and be deviant. So it must be something out there in the environment. We seek to explain deviance by other means and look at what's out there in the environment. What are they exposed to in the environments in which someone is living that would predispose them there. So not necessarily something biological. So the first approach we want to take a look at is the functionalist perspective. Now, according to functionalists, deviance is a common part of human existence because it helps to define the limits of proper behavior. What is that proper behavior? In Emil Durkheim, we have the Durkheim's legacy. Durkheim viewed social control mechanisms like punishments as necessary to define acceptable behavior and contribute to social stability. So functionalist, he introduced that term anomie. If you remember, we mentioned that earlier in the earlier chapters. This term anomie to describe this feeling one experiences when we lose direction in society. We feel hopeless. So this loss of direction or sense of normlessness occurs during periods of profound social change, like, go back, to think about the Industrial Revolution, or times of economic collapse, the Depression, recessions. Something actually we're experiencing right now during the pandemic. So there's a lot of people who feel hopeless and helpless, and with an illness that so many people are very worried about and nervous about. And so, we saw again that hopelessness and helplessness happen during the social unrest when we witnessed on TV and live TV a police officer being very completely murdering somebody on TV, and to the Black Lives Movement, people were enraged, and so during those times people can act out very aggressively because it's like who can we, like, how can we bring light to this, to our plate. And so frustrations, aggression, we see people become more aggressive, people can become very depressed. So we could see an increase in crime during these times, maybe even increases, upticks in suicide rates as well. So this other bullet I kind of glanced over is about Erikson, Kai Erikson is an American sociologist who described a function of deviance known as the boundary maintenance function. And Kai Erikson studied the wayward Puritans. He studied the Puritans. The title of his work was Wayward Puritans. And he studied the Puritans of the 17th century New England and the treatment of women, also known as the Salem witch trials. And what was happening during that time is the Puritans were continuously defining and redefining the social norms. Behavior that was once acceptable suddenly was being punished for being deviant. So usually these were the religious officials of the town and the community, and they would set the boundaries. So one day, the boundaries would be set. This behavior is considered wrong. And so you would avoid that. And then all of a sudden the next day, other behaviors that you thought were perfectly normal were then considered to be wrong. And so again, they constantly shifted the boundary on what was considered deviant. So women, and some men even, were subjected to hangings at the time of these witch trials. They were considered to be witches. And so again, that's another form of sort of deviance. Next, we have Merton's theory of deviance, very well-known sociologist by the name of Robert Merton. He adopted Durkheim's anomy to explain why people either conform or deviate from cultural expectations. And he examined an important societal goal in the U.S., which is success. And success, which is typically measured by wealth, obtaining wealth. And the means to which to obtain this wealth is through hard work. So you have a goal. The goal is to achieve success. In order to achieve that goal, you need to obtain wealth. And the means to obtain this goal is through hard work. So he seeks to explain, why do people accept or reject the goal of society, or any of the goals of society? Why people accept or reject the approved means of fulfilling their goals, and then ultimately why people accept or reject both the goals and the means to achieve these goals. And so we're going to go through the different types. There are 5 basic forms of what he calls adaptations. So Merton's anomy theory has 5 basic forms of adaptations. We have the conformist, the innovator, the ritualist, the retreatist, and the rebel. So let's go over these now. So Merton's theory of deviance, or also known as anomy theory of deviance, is how people adapt in certain ways by conforming to or by deviating from cultural expectations. So the first is the conformist, and this is a non-deviant individual. This person accepts the goal of society and the means to obtain the goal. So they want success, as an example. They want success. So they want to achieve wealth, and they're going to work really hard to get there. So they're going to be conforming members of society. Next, we have the retreatist. And the retreatist rejects both the societal goal and the means to attain them. And these people become withdrawn from society. So a drug addict, a vagrant, someone homeless, they fall into this category. In fact, even I would suggest that Jeannie Wiley's family was retreating. The father was really withdrawing from society. And bushes were growing up. They really were not interacting with the community. They were withdrawing from the society around them. That would be an example there too. The innovator is next, and an innovator accepts the goal. They would like to achieve success, but they may choose improper means to obtain them. So they want to achieve wealth, they want success, but they may do so by illegitimate means, by stealing, shoplifting, things like that. So that would be an innovator. The ritualist is next. And ritualist rejects the societal goal, yet they work towards the goal. And this individual doesn't really care about wealth, but they work out of ritual as a way of life. So a bureaucrat, someone in a bureaucracy, fits this example. They follow the rules without the larger goal being in mind. Another example would be somebody like Steve Jobs. Everyone knows Steve Jobs invented he was an inventor of the Apple, our iPhones, all that came from his mind. And so he really was an inventor. He did achieve great wealth, don't get me wrong, but it was something he did out of something he enjoyed doing. So that's a ritualist. Rebellion. Okay, so the rebel rejects the original goal of society and the means, and they will attempt to replace them. So if you're ever trying to understand the Occupy Wall Street movement, that's what they were about. Occupy Wall Street was looking to, so any kind of political organization really attempts to replace social structure. So they're rejecting that original goal, and they would be trying to do something about it to replace it. Now, functionalist theory offers a key contribution to our understanding of deviance. Yet there's really no systematic application to real-world crime. Like, why does a person commit a deviant act? Or why crimes do or do not occur. Here's a really good illustration of what we just talked about in the functionalist perspective in Merton's theory of deviance. And it says, the thumbs up, thumbs down that many of us are used to in our social media. But, the first is the non-deviant, the conformist. And then you have, accepting the goal, accepting the means. And so those are the criteria into fitting into these different types of behavior. So please let me know if there's anything you're unclear about on this in these examples. Okay, so as I said, the functionalist theory really does offer that key contribution to our understanding of deviance, and how to maintain a social stability. But it does not really explain the concept of real-world crime. So we look to the interactionist perspective, and the emphasis here is on everyday behavior in an attempt to explain crime and deviance. And within this perspective, there are two theories. There's cultural transmission theory, and then there's social disorganization theory. So first we'll talk about cultural transmission. So according to this theory, cultural transmission, humans learn how to behave. Humans learn how to behave in social situations, whether properly or improperly. So here we have on this slide a sociologist by the name of Edwin Sutherland. And Edwin Sutherland explained that individuals learn conforming and deviant acts through the socialization process. So we're going to either learn how to conform and obey the norms of society, or we're going to learn how to be deviant and disobey those norms. So he used the term differential association to describe the process of being exposed to criminal acts in a favorable light that leads to the violation of the rules. And this also applies to non-criminal acts like smoking, truancy, early sexual activity, those sorts of things. So, if you see something in a favorable light, somebody enjoying smoking and being tempted to smoke, you might be likely to do that. Not necessarily a criminal act there, but if you see, your peers engaging in criminal activity, that would also be an example of being exposed to that in a positive light. So this cultural transmission school emphasizes that one learns criminal behavior by interacting with others. You learn the techniques, the motives, the drives, and the rationalizations for the behavior. If someone shoplifts, baby formula and diapers, we needed this. So, there's a rationalization behind why someone went in and shoplifted that out of a convenience store. And just one other note here before I move to the next slide. You see Edwin Sutherland here, and he wrote this, The Professional Thief, where he actually went out and interviewed. He conducted an interview with someone who was a professional thief, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So as I was talking about this differential association, it describes the process through which we're exposed to these different attitudes in a favorable light to criminal acts, leading it to the violation of rules. So this term was developed by Sutherland. And critics say this idea fails to explain why people engage in certain kinds of behavior, like impulsive behaviors or behaviors done out of necessity. So in other words, we would be more likely to engage in norm-defying behavior if we belong to a group or subculture that stresses deviant values, like being a member of a street gang. But it all depends on the frequency, duration, and the importance of the type of social interaction. So it doesn't, those endorsing deviant behavior and those promoting acceptance of the social norms, it doesn't account for any first-time impulsive deviance. Like, okay, someone might be desperate, really desperate, down on their luck, needing the formula and diapers, and they do it in one time. It doesn't explain or justify that. That happens out of someone's impulsivity. But somebody who's exposed to it on a regular basis, daily interaction, it's frequent, it's long term. That's what this differential association is. This person's exposed to this on a regular basis. Okay, the second theory within this perspective is social disorganization theory, and this states that deviance in crime increases due to a breakdown or absence of communal relationships in other social institutions, such as the family, breakdown of the family, schools closing, churches being, abandoned, not having the congregation they once had, and even local government, the breakdown in government. And this theory developed out of the University of Chicago in the early 1900s. Clifford Shaw and Henry Mackay, they found higher rates of social problems in areas with decreased population and deteriorating buildings. So where we see, this theory does not account for any viable, healthy organizations that persist in these troubled neighborhoods. And it appears often to blame the victim. So critics say that there's a victim blaming element to this theory. It was developed to explain the disorganization that occurs as cities rapidly expanded, and they sort of couldn't adjust in theory. But the theory can explain why some troubled neighborhoods are very viable organizations, like for example, Camden. Think about some of the areas in Camden got huge, Cooper Hospital stands out, really, big, employs a large number of people in the city. But there's also different venues in that area. The aquarium, there's a venue where shows, I can't think of the name right now, but it used to be called, concerts take place there. I think you might know the name of it better than I at this moment. It's just escaping me at the moment. But you see organizations like that really are. Campbell's Soup is another company there. So that's an example of a city that has experienced this sort of disorganization due to people moving out Now we're seeing more people, tend to move back, and there's been a buildup in the city. So next we have the labeling perspective. And labeling theory seeks to explain why certain people are viewed as deviant while others engaging in the same behavior are not. And in this theory, we have sociologists. An example of this is sociologist William Chambliss's study of two groups of high school boys. This is a classic study. The boys were labeled the Saints and the Roughnecks. And the Saints were considered to be from good families, while the Roughnecks were viewed as lower class families. They were from the other side of the track, so to speak. But the Saints, considered to be, they were just sowing their wild oats, and they would be absolved from their behaviors. But the Roughnecks were viewed as troublemakers or bad kids, and so that label kind of stuck with them, and they were treated as such by the police, by their teachers, and so but these groups were both engaged in the similar behaviors. They were both engaging in truancy and drinking and vandalism. Yet their social class played a role in how they ended up turning out. So we see a lot of examples of this with labeling. Labeling theory emphasizes how a person comes to be labeled as deviant or to accept that label, because that's what happens. They, the individuals say, well, if they think I'm a troublemaker, I must be a troublemaker. So it looks at why people are viewed as being deviant. And Howard Becker is another sociologist that popularized this approach. The theory is also called the societal reaction approach, meaning it is the response to the act and not the behavior itself that determines the deviance. So a child may act out because of frustration, but it's a response to that. So a troublemaker, for example, assigned to a program for the learning disabled, or a learning disabled child who has not quite been classified, is labeled a troublemaker. It's happened to my son when he was in first grade. Many children with ADHD or autism or reading disability are mistakenly labeled as troublemakers because they act out in frustration, and so it's the reaction to that. That they must be bad. Well, they're really frustrated because they can't follow along to what's going on in the classroom. So it can have some profound effects. Now, labeling theory focuses on social control agents, and these agents are police, the probation officers, psychiatrists, judges, teachers, etc. These people play a significant role in creating the deviant identity by defining certain people as deviant. So these agents play that significant role in creating the deviant identity. One really profound example of this is racial profiling, and the laws that are designating certain people as being either illegal or undocumented citizens. So this theory, when you see racial profiling that occurred based on a stereotype, and so that would be a really a good example of labeling the use of stereotypes in targeting specific people by an agent, such as the police. So labeling theory is influenced the social constructionist perspective, which suggests that deviance is a product of the culture that we live in. The focus is on the decision-making process that creates the deviant identity. So for example, child abductors, deadbeat dads, date rapists, they've always existed, but they've become a major social concern due to policy makers and media coverage of them. So we see the focus is on the decision-making process that creates that deviant identity. Like, we need to focus on, going after deadbeat dads. Well, a lot of dads, in history, if you go back in sociology of the family, through family history, many men often abandoned their families, creating families in another town, in colonial times. And so, it's always been in existence, but it's where the decision makers tend to, like, we need to focus on this. And so it becomes a concern. Next, we have the conflict perspective. And conflict theory states that people with power protect their own interests and define deviance to suit their own needs. So Richard Quinney was a sociologist who suggested that the criminal justice system serves the interests of the powerful. And he says lawmaking is an attempt by the powerful to coerce others into their own morality, and that crime is defined by legislators and law enforcement officers in a politically organized society. He argues basically that there's no consistent application of societal values. So just an example of legalization of marijuana. Marijuana is considered to be illegal in most states, but yet cigarettes and alcohol, which could be in some cases even worse than are all legal. You have to be a certain age, though. So there's no consistent application of the lawmaking. And this argument, this perspective, this theory contends that the entire criminal justice system in the U.S. treats suspects differently based on their race, ethnicity, or social class. So we have this concept called differential justice, where conflict theory suggests that criminal suspects are treated differently. African Americans, for example, Latinos, are at a disadvantage in the justice system, both as juveniles and adults. And this may lead to increased violence and crime as those who view themselves as victims of unfair treatment strike out, but not necessarily against the powerful so much as against their fellow victims. And I think we saw a touch of this when, in the different communities where, the protests of the Black Lives Movement recently enraged so many, that they ended up, vandalizing and looting in their own neighborhoods. So it was just, a frustration that was being acted out. And I think that's as a result of this differential justice. There are examples of this also. I think your text refers to it in India in 2007, the killings in the slums of New Delhi, which went uninvestigated. Some people get shorter sentences. So there's differences in social treatment. Okay, next we have the feminist perspective. Criminologists Frida Adler and Meta Chesney-Lind. And the feminist perspective suggests that existing approaches to deviance and crime was developed with only men in mind. You can find early examples of this, for example, in cases of rape. Early legal views on spousal rape reflected the male composition of state legislatures. Husbands were not legally considered to have committed rape until 1993. Again, women and children were considered to be the property of the men. Also, society tends to treat women in a very stereotypical fashion, and cultural views and attitudes toward women influence how they are perceived and labeled. Sort of that old double standard of women versus men. Deviance, including crime, flows from economic relationships. So traditionally, men have had greater opportunity to commit crimes, such as embezzlement and fraud, because of their greater earning power. So when you're thinking it from the feminist perspective, as women start to assume more active and powerful roles, gender differences in deviance and crime are starting to narrow. And women, again, are starting to become more gain more earning power and be more exposed to those opportunities illegitimate opportunity structure as well. Okay, so here we have a table illustrating all of the different theoretical perspectives, and I hope this kind of helps you put this in mind, which perspectives, within which there are different approaches, different theories. So the functionalist perspective, we have the anomie theory of deviance, Emil Durkheim, Robert Merton, the adaptation to the different societal norms. The interactionist perspective, you have cultural transmission theory, social disorganizational theory, and also labeling. So those are all within the interactionist perspective, sort of where crime is, deviance is occurring at the everyday interaction, the different proponents, and the emphasis. And then you have conflict theory, Richard Quinney, and feminist theory, Frida Adler and Meta Chesney-Lind. Okay, now this last module, we're going to talk about crime and go over the different types of crime and how we classify crime in sociology. So I take a sociological approach to crime. Crime is a violation of criminal law for which some governmental authority applies formal penalties. Now, this is a side note, there are index crimes, and these are the 8 types of crime that are tabulated each year by the FBI. And these index crimes, you have crimes that are committed against people, that are violent. We call them the violent crimes: murder, rape, robbery, assault. And then we have crimes against property, which is burglary, theft, motor vehicle theft, and it also includes arson. Now, sociologists, we classify crimes into different types, and the types of crime are classified by how they are committed and how society views the offenses. So we have victimless, professional crime, organized crime, white-collar technology-based crime, hate crimes, which we'll talk about how can overlap in many of these instances, and then transnational crime. So there might be some overlap in the way we classify some of these, but we're just going to distinguish them at first. Victimless crimes there's a willing exchange among adults of widely desired but illegal goods and services. So examples of victimless crimes would be things like prostitution, drug abuse, gambling. Now, there's some activists that are attempting to decriminalize. There's an attempt at decriminalization. They're saying that these are impossible to prevent. So a proponent would say, these crimes are really impossible to prevent. That they are really not victimless because they're, there's a willing exchange among adults. However, critics say that over drinking, compulsive gambling, and illegal drugs do cause personal and property damage. Prostitution reinforces the idea that women are objects to be used for men's pleasure. Alcohol, drug abuse can lead to drunk driving. So there are organizations that get behind these and sort of like MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, working tirelessly to keep attention on the victims. So that there are victims, or families of gamblers, families of people who abuse drugs. Drunk driving can really, not only affect the victim but also, that person, their lives are going to be affected the rest of their lives. So enforcing stronger penalties and things like that are what these organizations sort of get behind. Okay, the next classification is professional crime, and these are committed by a career criminal. And it's a person who pursues crime as a day-to-day occupation. So a burglar, a safe cracker, a shoplifter, someone who hijacks cargo. They devote their entire working time to planning and executing these crimes, and they develop really skilled techniques and often enjoy a pretty high status among other criminals. So Edwin Sutherland, who I mentioned, we talked about earlier, he wrote an account. That was his work of describing the professional thief as an occupation in his interview. So we got somebody to open up to him and describe the behavior. That was written in 1937. Next, we have organized crime, and this is the work of a group that regulates relations between various criminal enterprises involved in illegal activities, including smuggling and the sale of illegal drugs, prostitution, and gambling. Often commonly known as the mafia. It's a secret activity evading law enforcement. They take over legitimate business. They gain influence over labor unions, corrupt public officials. They intimidate witnesses, and they tax merchants for protection services. So they'll take money from somebody and say, "Oh, we'll protect your business." They dominate in the world of illegal business. So they, just like a large corporation would dominate conventional business world. For many, they serve as a means toward upward mobility for anyone trying to escape poverty, especially new immigrants to the United States. Actually, sociologist Dan Bell described this, and typically reflects the latest immigrant group and describes an ethnic succession. So, for example, Irish Americans were the initial organized crime of the early 20th century, which then became Jewish Americans in the 1920s, and then ultimately in the early 1930s, Italians. And so whatever new immigrant group comes into America is where we see that onset of the organized crime, because you see these people who commit these crimes, who are flashy. They have flashy clothes and fancy cars and a lot of money, and it looks like a way out of poverty, when in fact it is a criminal way out. The global nature of organized crime can be found in acts of drug and arms smuggling, money laundering, and trafficking in illegal immigrants and stolen goods. So again, it overlaps into a lot of these other types of crime that we see evidence of. Okay, the next topic, or the next classification, is white-collar and technology-based crime. And these are illegal acts committed in the course of business activities by affluent or respectable people, air quotes. Income tax evasion, embezzlement, bribery, those sorts of things. Now, Edwin Sutherland, again, coined this term in 1939 in reference to individuals, but now it is broadened to include offenses by businesses and corporations. We have various things. First, I want to mention computer crime, and that's the use of technology to carry out embezzlement or electronic fraud. Identity theft would fall into this category too, and leave few traces. So cybercrime, I guess, would be also, the term used here on the slide. Illegal activity primarily conducted through the use of computer hardware or software. Identity theft is that common example. And it can still occur, a lot of people can see identity theft occurring through the mail when you go to purchase products at the store. You see sometimes, like, I remember one Christmas right after the holidays, Target came through their system was hacked, and so a lot of people were concerned about that. So in 2007 study by the FBI and the National White Collar Crime Center found over 1 million internet crimes were reported in less than 4 years. Also, you have to be careful to scams online, auction sites. Craigslist is very common. You see a lot of, there's very many, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of legitimate things that take place, eBay, Craigslist, but then there are also some some shady things that happen as well. You've got to be careful what site you're using. Notice a lot of, especially during the times now with the pandemic and a lot of people buying things online, through Facebook even, people are going and using all these different avenues, and then they're scamming people out of a lot of money. Recently, I saw on the news the new Airbnb, people who want to get away, a vacation, go to a vacation house, and people being scammed, and they're showing pictures of a house that might be up for sale, but is not being rented out for a vacation, and people are taking the money overseas, and you show up to your vacation, and the house is like, the people who are living there are like, no, we're not renting our house for a holiday. So things like that can happen through the technology. Corporate crime is an act by a corporation that is punishable by the government. And this takes on many forms. It includes individuals, it includes the organizations and institutions among its victims. Stock fraud, manipulation. I already mentioned Martha Stewart, Bernie Madoff, the Ponzi scheme. That would be something along these lines here. What he did with his investors, he took their money. It was sort of a pyramid scheme. I wish I was in class to kind of illustrate this to you. Where you have, let me try to do that here. You have someone here who they take their money, and then in order to pay them back, they need 2 additional investors in order to pay them back. Okay, so you have 2 people, and then to get these people back, you need you need 4 people here, and then so on and so on. And so in order to kind of, and what he was doing was taking these people's money with no intentions of giving them anything back, but just bringing more people in. If somebody did want, return on their investment, he, robbed Peter to pay Paul. So, it was a really, they made a movie about it. So if anyone is interested in learning about that further, it's called a Ponzi scheme. And the initial person it's named after was someone in organized crime, like from Italy. But bribery, environmental pollution is another example of this corporate crime. Dumping pollution illegally, bribery, corruption. Convictions for these types of illegal acts do not necessarily harm a person's reputation, nor do they necessarily, they may have to pay a fine, they may not serve prison time. Whereas the common street criminal may spend a lot of time in prison. So as much, again, as a street criminal would. Next thing I want to talk about are hate crimes. And hate crimes, compared to these other crimes we're talking about, are defined by the purpose of their conduct and not by those committing the crime. They're also known as bias crimes. And these are crimes based on race, religion, ethnic group, national origin, or sexual orientation. The government considers an ordinary crime a hate crime when the offender is motivated by one or more of these characteristics. So in 1990, Congress passed the Hate Crimes Statistics Act and started to really tabulate, what was the motivation behind some of these crimes. And in 2015, the official reports of 5,462 hate crimes and bias-motivated offenses. The vast majority committed by members of a dominant group against the relatively powerless. So, someone in the dominant group over, a minority member, based on someone's, in the LGBTQ community. Those sorts of, where it was involved hate. Religion is another motivation behind. However, we need to recognize that more than 50% are based on a person's race, ethnicity, or national origin. And this continues to rise. I mean, it was at strictly 48% when I first, I believe, started teaching this course, and now it's up to 57%. So these, are staggering statistics. Okay, and now we have transnational crimes, and these occur across multiple national borders. It spans the globe. And these are things like terrorism, slavery, the trafficking of human beings, that would be like the slave trade, endangered species, bringing, animals into, to the country, drugs, stolen art, piracy, among things. There's, I think, there's a list on the next slide to show you, guns, weapons, body parts. People will go into a poor area of the world, a poor community, and ask somebody, pay them money to donate a kidney. You can donate a kidney, and but they do it in very crude ways, and so infection can set in. So it's very, very dangerous. But people are so desperate in such poverty-stricken conditions that they would do that, and because there's such a need on the other end for transplants, you see people being taken advantage of in that sense. Now, this is not exclusive. Transnational crime is not exclusive of the other types of crimes we talked about. The organized crime, there's an increasingly global network of this happening. So technology ultimately facilitates these illegal activities, like the trafficking of child sex trade and pornography. The International Crime Police, the Interpol, is it's known as the International Crime Police Organization, is an effort to really attempt to control this type of crime. But there's definitely concern over jurisdictional encroachments. And so here you have, again, some additional examples: counterfeiting, hijacking of planes, environmental crime, piracy, I think I mentioned that one, terrorism, computer crime. People are doing that computer crime transnationally, as I mentioned about, the story I just recently heard. People are trying to plan vacations with this pandemic in the summertime. It's like, oh, let's get away, but let's go to a home. They're sending money, and actually not realizing they're sending it overseas, and going to a house that a picture was posted of a house that was on sale. So it's really, technology has really become a big part of this as well. So there's a lot of overlap with the other types of crime. All right, another thing I want to talk about are statistics, because we have to be very, very careful too with crime statistics. They're not as accurate as social scientists as we would like them to be. Reported crimes, what we hear in the media, is very high in the United States. So as a public, we regard crime as a very major social problem. However, we got to remember that they're only tracking crimes that have been reported to law enforcement. So these data serve as indicators of police activity and approximate levels of certain crimes. So because of the media, crime is regarded as a serious problem. One incident of a criminal act, gunfire, a murder, is really serious. But if we look at the real data, crime being reported in 2012 was comparable to what it was back in 1963. So we need to really try to understand. There has been a significant decline in violent crimes in recent years. That's the crime committed against persons. Violent and property crimes have dropped by 23% in the last 10 years. So these declines have been reported in a lot of the victimization surveys. Also, we want to think about the feminist movement. Scholars have indicated that the proportion of major crimes committed by women has increased. However, the violent crimes by females have declined. So in order to understand some of these crime statistics, we need to understand, the rates. There's been a significant decline in the violent crime nationwide. Because of, again, community-oriented policing, crime prevention programs, gun control laws, and an increase in the prison population, keeping criminals off of the streets. There's also been changes in public policy, public health, technology, and demographics. Again, and it's interesting to note, we mentioned just previously that the proportion of major crimes committed by women has increased. Seeing that between 1999 and 2008, the Department of Justice found female arrests for major reported crimes increased by 12%, while the comparable male arrests declined by 19%. One explanation made by Dr. Frida Adler suggested an increase in women's opportunities as a result of the feminist movement. Again, this is the property crimes, not the violent crimes, as we saw in that previous slide. Now, this measuring of these crime rates is conducted several ways. We look at the crime index published annually by the FBI as part of the Uniform Crime Reports. This includes statistics on murder, rape, robbery, assault, burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle theft, and arson. And these are disproportionately devoted to property crimes. You see the data. The limitation is that they include only crimes actually reported to law enforcement agencies. So that's the data we're going to be seeing. The violent crimes, we'll see a table and see how these numbers have actually. So here we see a table of crime trends and how the actual the rates have, the percent change has really decreased in every category: murder, rape, robbery, ag assault, burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle. I think arson is the only thing that's not included in here. You have the actual number reported, then you have a rate, and then you have the percent change. So moving in the right direction, but again, we have to be cautious of these numbers because, again, one murder is serious to whoever's family that is, and so we need to be conscious of those things as well. Another thing we take a look at are national crime victimization surveys. And this was initiated in 1972, and it is an annual report compiled by the Bureau of Justice Statistics based on interviews of U.S. households asking ordinary people whether they were victims of specific crimes during the preceding year. So it does require the victims understand what happened to them. They have to be willing to share the experience with the interviewers. And also crimes like fraud, tax evasion, blackmail are really unlikely to be reported. And here we see that today's victimization rate has dropped to less than half of the 1993 rate. There's no one explanation for this. Crime Watch maybe in neighborhoods. Again, maybe reporting less. So we kind of see a really significant drop. So again, community-oriented policing could be an explanation. The new gun control laws, a massive increase in prison population, which at least prevents inmates from committing crimes outside prison. We have new surveillance techniques, cameras. People have cameras now on their doorsteps, and cameras in our phones. Better residential security, business security. The decline of the crack cocaine epidemic, which soared in the late 1980s, and the aging of the population as the number of people in their 50s increased and the number in their 20s decreased. So we're seeing, again, shifts in demographics. International crime rates. If you look at internationally, violent crime rates are higher in the U.S. than in Western Europe. Began in the 1980s. Here we have England, Ireland, Denmark, and New Zealand have higher rates of car theft than in the United States. There have been disturbing increases in violent crimes, rapid rise in homicide rates, especially in developing countries. So the possible reasons for a higher rate of violent crime in the U.S. is greater emphasis on individual economic achievement, the stress put on people for that, culture's long tolerance of many forms of violence as well.